Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's fourth installment of a public initiative hosted by the US Asia Institute, Northeast Asia in Focus. For those of you who have attended our other events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Megan Yo, and I am a senior program assistant at the US Asia Institute. For a bit of brief background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 43-year track record of building understanding between the people and governments of the United States and Asia. This specific series will provide unique opportunities for the public to engage in issues of importance to the region of Northeast Asia, as Northeast Asia continues to be a region of economic, strategic, and political importance. Gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges and opportunities the region faces and areas for further US engagement is paramount. Northeast Asia in Focus targets congressional staff, US executive branch officials, foreign diplomats, and members of the policy and business communities. Today's briefing will focus on the cultural underpinnings of domestic and foreign policy, as well as the historical and societal context by which Northeast Asian governments interact with each other and the US. Now, I'd like to get the briefing started with just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to give a special thanks for the support of USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. Shein, The Sands, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, and Fairfield Maxwell. And I also like to note that during the last 15 to 20 minutes or so of the briefing, there will be time for questions from the audience. If you have a question that you would like our speakers to address, please type it in the Q&A function at any time, or you can directly message me if you prefer. We are honored to have with us today distinguished experts on the region. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists for the discussion. First, I would like to welcome Ms. Rui Zhong. Rui Zhong is the Program Associate for the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center. Next, I would like to welcome Professor Kiyoteru Tsutsui. Kiyoteru Tsutsui is the Henry H. and Tomoye Takahashi Professor and Senior Fellow in Japanese Studies at Shorenstein A-Park, the Director of the Japan Program at A-Park, a Senior Fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and Professor of Sociology, all at Stanford University. You can find the full bios of our speakers in the program, which will be posted in the chat function. Now on to today's briefing. I will begin by passing it to Professor Tsutsui for his remarks. Rui will then offer her comments, then we'll engage in a brief discussion before taking as many of your questions as time allows. Professor Tsutsui, I will now pass it over to you.
Right, thank you, Megan, and thank you to US Asia Institute for having me back to speak about Japan, Asia, and other issues. So today I was asked to talk about cultural underpinnings of policy making in, I guess, in Japan, in Asia, and history. So it's kind of hard to talk about culture in the abstract and its impact on policymaking. Culture, I don't see culture as some kind of immutable law that governs human behavior. It's always changing, and it doesn't shape people's behavior uniformly, even within a same country, same society, same community. So I will very briefly talk about some sort of standard stereotypical understandings about Japanese culture. But I'd like to spend more time on history, because history certainly does shape policymaking in Japan. And there's a lot that we can talk about in that area. So culture, if you take some course on Japanese society, Japanese culture, there are certain themes that always sort of percolate up. Back in the 80s, when Japan was the emerging superpower, China of today China is, in the 80s, Japan was an economic threat to the United States. And back then, there was a lot of discussion about, there are a lot of theories of Japanese society, Japanese culture that were promoted as people outside of Japan try to understand Japan, and Japanese people themselves happily fed that desire to understand Japan. And I mean, that was not the beginning. You know, back during World War II, also there was a lot of research, anthropological, sociological studies done to understand Japan. And what emerged out of that literature is understanding of Japan as a collective, as opposed to individual kind of culture, group orientation. So teamwork is valued, team players are valued, sacrificing for greater good for the group, for the community. Those things are valued. And there's this contrast between culture of shame and versus culture of sin. Presumably Western, the United States and Europe, Western nations operate under the principle of culture of sin, where moral compass resides within the individual, and they, based on often they're religious, but moral understandings and beliefs, they make judgments about what appropriate social and individual behavior might be. Whereas in Japan, it's more like culture of shame, where people tend to worry about how they're perceived by others in the group. That contrast has often been played up in talking about Japanese society. There's also this related to that egalitarian orientation about how you don't want to stand out in Japanese society. You want to blend in and do the same things as other people do. There's this famous proverb saying about in Japanese society about how the nail that sticks out gets hammered. So if you stand out, you get punished for standing out, even if it's in a good way. There's some truth to that argument. There's actually a lot of truth to that argument. Whether there's a direct link between that cultural understanding and policymaking, we can debate that, but there's certainly more of an egalitarian tendency in looking at economic inequality. So people in Japan often look at the American economy and how Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, how those people make not 100 times more, but more like thousands or 10,000 times more than regular folks. That really doesn't work well in Japan. I mean, they are wealthy people, but they often, as opposed to looking at them as heroes that made it, there's more of a tendency to try to bring them down. So there's often some kind of scandal. People are like gunning for some kind of scandal around those very successful, very wealthy people in Japan. In the US too, to a certain extent, but I think the degree to which people try to bring down hammers that stick out is a little bit different. So there's some, and also I would say there's this famous book by Chie Nakane, The Vertical Society, discussing Japan as a vertical society where people commit to their immediate social group. And it's very important for them to belong to a social group. If you're going to school, your classmates, if you're going to work, your work environment, that's the immediate society. And you really commit almost 100% to that group. And you also need to find where you are in the hierarchy of that organization. That's why it's vertical. And then you find your place and then you behave accordingly. That permeates Japanese society to a certain extent. And that's one reason why seniority, for instance, is such an important aspect. If you look at how Japanese politicians, like LDP politicians, who get to be who get to occupy certain important positions in their cabinet, minister position, it's often not just about talent or capacity, but also about seniority. Somebody who has been in the Diet, the National Parliament of Japan, for many years, even if that person is not particularly suited for a certain position, he or she might often, there's not a lot of female politicians in Japan, he or she might often get a ministerial appointment despite some lack of capacity to actually execute policies there. That tendency has decreased because people, if you don't know what you're talking about as a defense minister, that becomes criticized more today. But there are some, I wouldn't name which exact ministry is like that, but minister is like that. But there are certain ministerial positions that are not entirely clear what background experience or what capacity is required. And those positions sometimes, maybe even often, are taken by somebody whose turn is coming next. So seniority is still an important role, and that's in Japanese society. If you start talking about somebody's merits or talents or capacity, it's somewhat subjective, so it's difficult to determine. So the safest option is to go to seniority. Right? Age is a quantified, clear number that people use to make decisions about who should take senior positions, senior as in influential, important positions. Gender also comes into play in a bad way has been for a long time. There's tendency for men to be prioritized in those kinds of decisions, and Japanese society as a whole is trying to change that. So things are maybe getting somewhat better, but you still see 2 or 3 out of 30 cabinet members being female. That's not great, right? So culture, yeah, I mean, we can talk about all of that kind of thing and how that shapes Japanese policy making. But I think history is more interesting and important. I don't want to take too much of the time today. Try to be brief, but so history really does shape policy debates in Japan. And I mean, we can go all the way back to whatever, 8th century or something, but I think it's probably good to start with 1945, the post-World War II Japan, as Japan was defeated in World War II and it started as a democratic nation. I mean, we cannot forget that Japan was a fairly vibrant democracy in up to the 1920s, 30s. But really, Japan's new start as a democratic society is in 1945. And Japan's national identity really shifted from being a multi-ethnic empire. The pre-World War II, or pre-1945 Japan was definitely a multi-ethnic nation. And there is some recognition of that, although there was some homogenizing forces. And then Japan lost all the territories outside and became a island nation that it was for a long time. And now the identity shifted from multi-ethnic empire to a homogeneous nation. So the presumed homogeneity, I put homogeneous in quote unquote, the presumed homogeneity was a very important part of Japan's post-World War II identity. And that really shapes immigration policy and how Japan does not like to accept immigrants or asylum seekers, refugees, right? All those things are affected by Japan's history and identity as a homogeneous nation. There's also an important aspect of how the World War II has been understood in Japan. There is, when I say this to American audience, often people are surprised. There has been this dominant narrative of victimhood, right, which is kind of surprising considering Japan was the aggressor during the war. But there was this victim narrative permeating Japanese society for a long time. The first several decades of post-World War II Japan was dominated by this victim narrative, whereby people, the lay Japanese, see themselves or framed themselves as victims of the wartime regime. So there are some bad, and the emperor, because there was no prosecution of the emperor was not incriminated. So it's the bad coteries, Hideki Tojo and all those people, bad coteries around the emperor who gave bad advice and had bad policy. That led to reckless war and the defeat eventually. That was the narrative, and to prevent that from happening, to recover from that, Article 9 of the Constitution prohibiting Japan from having capacity to engage in a war, that was enshrined in the Constitution, and that became a very important part of, again, another very important part of Japan's post-war identity. And another thing that's important to understand is the nuclear allergy in Japan. Along with that narrative of victimhood was something that everybody who grew up in Japan understands or learned at school, which is the importance of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So every August, there's a ceremony, 6th in Hiroshima, 9th in Nagasaki, commemorating the dropping of the atomic bombs, and almost all of the elementary to high school kids, at some point they would visit Hiroshima, maybe Nagasaki too, but often Hiroshima, go to the nuclear weapons, nuclear victims museum, and lay a flower or origami cranes, and that has become a very important part of Japan's identity, is this aversion to anything nuclear, especially nuclear weapons, and that continues on today. And the current Prime Minister Kishida, being from Hiroshima, is also somewhat relevant, because it's a very important part of a lot of people from Hiroshima have the strong identity about Hiroshima being that place of anti-nuclear weapons, the center of nuclear weapons movement. So Prime Minister Kishida really prioritizes that issue, understanding, he understands, he's an LDP politician, ruling party politician, so he understands that Japan is under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, has been ever since the end of World War II, but he would still harbor some, or at least demonstrate some desire to contribute to elimination of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. So that's another important component. And you probably hear a lot about the history issues between Japan and South Korea, especially, and China. That also is part of how that's relevant. The understanding of among the Japanese public that they are victims is relevant to this. There was very little discussion of how Japan victimized Asians in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and so on. There was very little discussion of that up until the 80s. In the 80s, those issues came up, and the Japanese perception changed a little bit, but having that victimhood identity for a few decades after the end of World War II, it was difficult to completely eliminate that and plant this understanding of Japan as the aggressor. So people have a general understanding that Japan was a colonial kind of expansionist power, but a lot of people still make the argument that Japan was trying to liberate Asia from European colonial powers, and Japan did some good in Korea or China. That narrative still percolates up here and there. It's kind of hard to completely eliminate that. So that certainly doesn't fly well in the public discourse in South Korea or China. So this history issue about different understandings of World War II history in Japan vis-a-vis China and Korea, that often becomes a diplomatic issue, which is, it's kind of amazing. It's been, 70, 80 years since the end of World War II, and it's still a hot button issue between those countries. Southeast Asia, Japan was almost as aggressive in Southeast Asia as in China or Korea, but it's not as big of an issue. And I think it has a lot to do with how Japan handled issues there, but also how Southeast Asia really needed South Korea until the 80s as well. They needed Japan's economic help, aid, and investment. And also, I arguably, Japanese politicians handled things somewhat better in Southeast Asia after the shock of the initial Tanaka riots, when when some prime ministers in Japan visited Southeast Asia, there were riots, and Japanese people realized that the scars of Japan's occupation run quite deep in that region. So they kind of changed their approach. Anyway, so that's World War II history. And there's a lot of more recent history that shapes Japanese politics today. I think I should probably stop here. So, I mean, the Cold War politics certainly played an important role. US as a friend, ally, the guardian of Japan, Soviet and other communist countries as enemies. Now, one thing to note is that China, the Japanese public's understanding or favorable rating toward China was quite high until the 80s, and things changed since then. It speaks to how China becoming more of a competition and threat, and that really changed the Japanese understanding, Japanese attitude toward China. And also in the economic realm, the successes, Japan was again economic behemoth in the 80s up until the early 90s. And this experience of success in that period has haunted Japanese efforts to reform its economic system. There's a lot of arrogance on the part of major corporations in Japan that had this great success in the 80s, thinking that the Japanese way is still the way to go. We don't have to learn from Silicon Valley or the startups, venture capital, all these new kinds of more dynamic, vibrant, ever-changing kind of economic model. Japan doesn't really need to do that. There was a strong sentiment, barriers for change for a long time. Now, I think people are finally realizing and understanding the need for real change. I hope it's not too late, but it came very late because of the success of the 80s. In contrast to countries like South Korea, where major corporations like Samsung, LG, they were very quick to adapt to a new dynamic economic environment of the technology industry. North Korean abduction issue that emerged in the early 21st century, that's very important. People are very strongly against North Korea because of that abduction of Japanese citizens that got revealed, exposed in these violations were taking place in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but they got exposed in the last 20 years or so. And the 2011 triple disaster, the earthquake and the tsunami and nuclear, Fukushima, the nuclear plant crisis, that has had a lot of people thought that would have a lasting impact on Japan's energy policy, especially as it relates to nuclear plant and its restarting. But now that the Ukraine and all of that is creating energy issues, energy shortage, Prime Minister Kishida just talked about how Japan might explore options to build a new nuclear plant, not the Fukushima kind of big ones, but smaller, more nimble, presumably safer ones. But he started talking about it, which is a kind of a sea change considering how allergic Japan was to nuclear plants right after 2011 disaster. I think I talked too much, so I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to take any questions and engage in more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Tsutsui for your insights on Japan's history and culture. I'll now invite Ms. Chong to give her remarks.
Well, good afternoon from the Washington, D.C. area. Before I get started with my remarks, I'd like to give a big thanks to USAI for inviting and also setting up this event. My name is Ray. I'm a program associate at the Wilson Center China program. And so I was invited to talk about Chinese culture and the sort of current political and diplomatic outlook. So when we say Chinese culture, I'm really going to zoom in on the political culture of the People's Republic of China, mostly 2022 focus, because Chinese culture can range from anywhere to, you know, what people eat, art, history, etc. But for me specifically, for the purposes of, you know, policy related stuff, I like to sort of keep the scope of this to what is happening with leadership and how people engage with it, and you know how China's state engages with the world. So as of 2022, we're starting to see really an ascendant trend in nationalism. This notion of pride in relative stability, given China's experiences with COVID-19, and persistence in the usage of COVID zero management strategies. You're also starting to see these types of kind of feedback loops of propaganda work in different types of disasters or political social troubles, such as recent heat waves through central China. And this type of propaganda is called positive energy, which is really just flooding the zone with stories about heroic first responders, with, you know, people going above and beyond. And honestly, like a lot of these people, they do deserve praise and credit. However, it's the way that these stories are presented are a way of really cutting off or co-opting dissent. We sort of see positive energy propaganda here in the United States when they say like, oh, this kid like sold lemonade in order to like pay for his brother's cancer treatment or something. So it's like, oh, it feels so like it's so cute that they did this, but the cancer treatment problem is not really addressed as much. We also see the rise of ethno-nationalist terminology in how the party and party officials talk about you know, the blood of the Chinese people, the genetic makeup of the nation, and these health related metaphors are also indicative of this idea of sort of ridding the country, political system, society of undesirable elements. So as a result, we've seen a sort of pruning back of a lot of civic spaces, whether they are feminists, whether they are, you know, people who are into different subcultures. Tattoos are still like fairly consistently censored on Chinese TV, and sort of beyond. In fact, you even have people, you know, who were posting the Internationale, which is which is like this communist anthem that in the incorrect context when they were dissatisfied with some kind of labor issue or another. So even, you know, the history of communism itself is not exempt from crackdowns within China. So within this sort of environment of, you know, increased nationalism, increased rallying around Xi Jinping thought and Xi Jinping leadership, I would like to really try to give all of you this one sort of piece of advice. If you walk away today, I think this is a good takeaway to have. And it's, you know, you of course want to watch what people say, you know, what they say about China, what they say about China's place in the world. But you also want to watch what they do instead to prepare for the current environment. people can say that they are really, happy that China has fewer COVID deaths than the US, and it does. I'm not going to deny that. But at the same time, when you're starting to see COVID restrictions hit different Chinese cities, they're still going to the supermarket and making sure they buy food, just in case the neighborhood committee doesn't sort of follow through on its commitment to provide supplies. You're starting to see, people say they have confidence in, Chinese healthcare systems, etc., but they're still, calling in favors to get a hospital bed if a family member is sick. Same goes for, real estate interests overseas, education, so on and so forth. So watching what people do is still kind of an interesting litmus test for, this is not a homogenous society. People aren't marching in lockstep. Chinese people do not think about politics in a hive mind, contrary to, popular political sort of almost a meme at this point, but popular political ideas here in the West. So just to sort of wrap up in my last, I guess, 5 minutes, I do want to talk about China's relationships with other states. And I would say that in foreign policy, the political culture is that the relationships with other states do not take priority over the political security of Xi Jinping and of the CCP. Their sort of domestic facing propaganda is still fairly strong when it comes to how they talk about the United States, how they talk about Japan, in some cases, how they talk about India, or whatever state of the week, like Lithuania, that took the position they don't like on Taiwan. Below the sort of nation to nation level, we're starting to see an exodus of foreigners on the rise and the sort of declining quality of people to people exchange. I think only fairly recently did we start to see some of the educational exchanges to China open back up. And from the sort of indications that we're getting, I think in the medium to longer run, the government is trying to sort of maybe wean the country from relying on, as many foreign business and economic exchanges than it has in the past. Outside of, I think, the global north, the usage of, economic and vaccine diplomacy and multilateral influence has really been a bid to really make Chinese diplomatic views and political views more of a status quo on Taiwan, South China Sea, so on and so forth. The responses to the recent UN human rights report on Xinjiang and how multilateral organization diplomats sort of maneuver themselves will be really interesting to sort of watch as the Chinese state will try to flex its diplomatic muscles to try to push back on the allegations made in the report. So overall, I think with the political culture within the Chinese government is that the hawks are in the driver's seat. You're seeing a lot more sort of wolf warrior style diplomacy in not only what diplomats are saying on a week-to-week basis, but in terms of the longer term planning, who gets promoted, who gets more and more say in, how the foreign ministry operates. You're seeing people like Zhao Lijian really rise in prominence. Hua Chunyin, who's been there for a very long time, has kind of taken on some of the bombastic characteristics of how Zhao has responded. Whereas in like intellectual and in political circles, people who might be a little bit more critical or who might have pushed back on Xi are sort of ousted. I was reading an article earlier today by Cai Xia, who is a former top Communist Party educator who was expelled from the party and expelled from China and is in the US on exile. And I thought it was really interesting what she was writing because basically she argues that as you know the political system coalesces around a single leader, Xi Jinping, it starts to reflect the strengths and flaws of that leader. So I thought this was an interesting point because Xi began his time in office in 2012. We don't know when it will end. By launching an anti-corruption campaign that coincidentally managed to hit a bunch of his political rivals. And so as time goes on, she has asserted more and more direct control and central control over propaganda bureaus, over the diplomatic message, and over some other areas that were previously the premier's purview. And you might be wondering, but they're in the same party. Why would they, grapple over who does what and who can oversee what? They're in the same party, but they're still distinct politicians. And so this type of friction between top leaders is not new. It's been there since Mao. Mao himself was a big player in that type of political jostling. And so but the results of the Xi era is these types of power shifts have, consequences that go way beyond China, certainly affects countries that China is, has diplomatic relations with, positive or negative. And so as we sort of head into October, that is the future of Xi politics, I think, is the name of the game. So with that, I will end my remarks and happy to take any questions.
Thank you to Ms. Zhong for your very insightful comments on Chinese political culture. So we have a few audience questions, which we will also be integrating into our discussion. So to kick the discussion off, I was just wondering if I may ask both Ms. Zhong and Professor Tuzue, how do you see perspectives on culture and history in Japan and China changing, especially amongst the younger generation? So for instance, Prof. Tuzue, I think you talked about how Japan may be starting a return to nuclear power. And an audience member also posed a question about whether the narrative surrounding Japan's role in World War II has evolved to become more balanced and also, I guess, include Japan's aggression.
So on the history question, kind of goes back and forth. As I said, up until the mid 80s, when there was this textbook controversy whereby the Japanese textbooks, history textbooks, describe Japan's aggression in Asia as, allegedly the government tried to impose a more moderate term for aggression. That elicited response from South Korea and China, and there was this whole controversy, and that's when things really started going south. And then there was a better, I think, a better understanding in Japan about victimization of Asians during World War II. So there was this strong, and then it was concurrent with the rise of global human rights norms, especially the norms about revisiting past injustices, past human rights violations. And South Korean and Japanese activists used that momentum quite well in advancing something like the Comfort Women movement. And so the 90s up to the 2000s, Japan was on defense in this regard and started acknowledging more wrongdoings. And it was kind of back and forth because there were some right-wing politicians in Japan making silly statements about to deny Japan's wrongdoing during World War II. So it went back and forth. But there was a fairly healthy debate then and growing recognition. Then I think things shifted a little bit as South Korea in particular in the movement for Comfort Women redress went a little bit too aggressive in my view. And some of that got exposed recently with those people who are allegedly addressing the conflict women issue are kind of exploiting the victims themselves, surviving former conflict women. There was always this, there has been this back and forth, and South Korea, the movement went a little bit far, and in Japan, especially the LDP regime, started kind of dismissing that in the international scene. And there was this, especially after the 2015 accord between South Korea and Japan, which people thought finally resolved this history issue. And then that was under President Park in South Korea, and President Moon went back on it and kind of said it didn't happen. So, people in Japan, especially politicians, were up in arms about that. And there was another back and forth, and it's kind of an ugly scene diplomatically. So all in all, it was pretty simple up until the 80s. Japan just didn't do enough to acknowledge the wrongdoing. And then right now, it's a little more complicated because it's being used as a political tool, diplomatic tool on both sides. So whether the youth today have good understanding about what happened before 1945, I'm not entirely sure. Because the Japanese textbook, again, went back and forth. There was very little about Asian victimhood. And then there's a lot, well, maybe not enough, but there's a lot more in the 90s, 2000s, early 2000s. And then it got scaled back again. And then in the public discourse too, there was, in the 90s, there was a very strong push to acknowledge more of Japan's wrongdoing. I don't know if that exists today. So there's this apology fatigue and all of that in Japan. So whether the youth, right, they come with a clean slate. So they have to study, they have to understand what happened, and they would take in whatever the current discourse might be. So I'm worried a little bit that we need to continue to educate the Japanese youth about World War II and Japan's aggressions. And that's an aspect that, it happens everywhere right now. US is grappling with critical race theory and all of that. How to handle its ugly past haunts everybody. Germany has been touted as a country that handled a Nazi past well. Well, it may have done well with France, but now Poland is asking for reparation, right? How would Germany handle that? So this ugly past rears its head occasionally, and history education is critically important. In other areas, how the young generation in Japan, how do they how do they behave? How have their belief patterns changed? So along with the history issue, they come into the world and they look at the dangerous neighbors, and Russia invades Ukraine. It's a dangerous world out there. So there might be somewhat more of possibility that the young Japanese would go for more of increased defense budget or something like that. I do not see it right now at this point yet, and I think that speaks for Japan's strong history education. If not the education about past aggression, there's very, very strong education about Japanese victims. There's a lot that students learn in classrooms about how Japanese people suffered during World War II, and war is terrible. War is always terrible. And if you arm yourself, even for your self-defense, that would potentially increase the chances of war. That is an understanding, kind of a prevalent understanding in Japan still. That kind of deviates from my more realistic understanding about deterrence. I think Japan can increase the defense budget, and that would actually contribute to decreasing the chances of something happening in Taiwan, for instance. A lot of people in Japan actually think the other way, that if Japan increases defense budget and defense capacity, that would provoke China, and there'll be greater chances of something happening in Taiwan. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's still a strong understanding. So in that sense, in terms of peace education, that's still very strong, and I don't see Japan turning into some military power tomorrow. But again, these things can change over time. And Japan is a country where public mood shifts fairly quickly. So I think we really want to be vigilant about educating young people on those issues. Sorry, it's a wrong-winded answer to your question about youth in Japan. I think you're muted.
Oh, Ms. Song, would you like to answer to a question as well? Thank you very much, Professor Tsutsui.
Sure. So just to sort of add to that, I really like one sort of touch point on, I think, Japanese aggression that was fairly recent was the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe, because this really was a reflection moment for not just, Japanese people who were really shocked about how could this happen? Somebody just like home assembled a gun and attacked someone during a political rally. At the same time, though, in a lot of these sort of reflections on legacy, you have this sense of, well, Abe prioritized East Asian security values in a way that is aligned with the United States. And so in that process, they kind of brush over his early 2000s lobbying for right-wing Japanese causes, and also some of the scandals that were really dragging down his administration in the last couple of years of it, including some scandals tied to the 2020 Olympics, which he campaigned for. In terms of nationalism, anti-Japanese nationalism, though, China is obviously kind of one of the obvious players in this. There were people going like, there was a lot of, I'm not going to say it was all gloating, but there was some gloating within Chinese social media upon the assassination, where other people were like, what's wrong with you? This is an assassination. This is like have some standards. But this type of historical wound is still really present within China, and sometimes it's used as a basis for the buildup of China's own military-industrial complex. But I think definitely it's the case that Southeast Asia isn't discussed enough, and the sort of historical overview of colonialism and imperialism in general requires a bit more work from many parties involved, including the US.
Thank you for your answers. So I think we also have some questions from the audience regarding China's foreign relations for Ms. Tong. So one attendee asked about whether there have been any trend changes in terms of foreign direct investment from China, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and also how do you expect China's relationship to Central Asian nations to evolve in the coming years, especially to former Soviet states, in light of factors like the Russian-Ukrainian war?
Yeah, Xi Jinping I think he's about to visit Kazakhstan as his first overseas visit since COVID-19 started, and also he's expected to meet with Putin in Uzbekistan. They've been kind of sitting on the fence in terms of Russia-Ukraine, mostly because if they are really overt in taking a side on Putin, then it serves as a flashpoint for lots of maybe economic backlash that China would really rather not have right now, because productivity is not at the optimal levels since before COVID-19, and COVID-0 has also throttled manufacturing and service sector productivity in less than ideal ways. However, Xi Jinping's political security comes first, so they will keep doing COVID zero. Although some factories in China have still, done like little closed loop things where workers will bus from their dorms to the factory floors. In terms of foreign direct investment, I don't have, I think, numbers or trends off the top of my head, but I think the notion of the Belt and Road Initiative right now is still that infrastructure loans, projects, etc., is still seen by the continent as a little bit more involved and a little less, not to say preachy, but a little less sort of prescriptive than American foreign policy has been in the region. So not to say that it is ideal or, not without Chinese security interests, but that has been the general observation from some of the African states that I have read about.
Thank you. We also have another question from the audience. I think it's about, so given the lingering memories of Japanese imperialism, partly in, I think the attendee gave the example of South Korea, what do you anticipate will be the international response to a pro-military amendment of Article 9 that expands the SDF's operational capabilities? And I think the attendee also was asking about how Putin's motivation to invade Ukraine under the banner of nationalism and the glorification of the Soviet era could have parallels to Japan's right-wing faction as well, and whether there's like a possible threat that the Japanese right-wing faction may do something similar. So maybe Professor Tsutsui, would you like to take this question?
Do something similar as in invade some kind. I just don't think it's going to happen. So the invasion of Ukraine really has shaken Japan to, Russia is Japan's neighbor too. And there have been these territorial issues, the Northern Territories. And right after, well, I don't know if it's still going on, but there was some discussion after Russia's invasion of Ukraine about Hokkaido, how Hokkaido might not be safe. I think it's somewhat far-fetched. I don't think Putin would just invade Hokkaido, but the security in the northern part of Japan is an important issue. As for constitution, I don't know if there's any kind of what was the phrase, pro-military revision of Article 9. What is discussed is whether to officially put down self-defense force as a thing in the Constitution or not. And Article 9 has been reinterpreted many times. It's practically already kind of have been revised. So, the way I see it, if there's a constitutional revision and Article 9 is revised, that would just be a matter of kind of reflecting the reality of self-defense force as Japan's self-defense force. So I haven't seen any really pro-military kind of revision ideas, and I don't think it's going to pass. Even the current version that I described still faces a lot of opposition. People thought when my colleague talked about Abe's assassination, when that happened, people talked about how that might rile up some sentiments in Japan on the right, but center right, about changing the constitution, and Abe might sacrifice his life to actually make his goal happen, which is to change the constitution. But Prime Minister Kishida initially gestured toward it a little bit, but he's kind of stepping away from it. It will be not a particularly popular thing to do right now. Now things could change if China makes a move in Taiwan or something happens in East Asia. Things could change, but as of now, it's still difficult to actually make it happen, the constitutional revision. And Article 9 in particular, as I said, there is this understanding peace education is strong, this identity of Japan as a peaceful nation still very strong, and lay people, it's hard to gauge what proportion of the Japanese public thinks this way, but still a lot of people think that it's Japan's better off not getting involved in some kind of military conflict that doesn't entail somebody invading Japan directly. So I think it's going to be difficult to change the constitution, and it's not going to be a pro-military revision if it happens anytime soon.
Thank you, Professor Tsutsui. We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you to all those who submitted their questions, and we're really sorry that we could not get to everyone's questions. I'd like to give a huge thank you to Ms. Zhong and Professor Tsutsui for joining us and providing their excellent insight. We were honored to host you, and we appreciate the time you have taken out of your busy schedules to deliver your valuable perspectives. And though we are out of time, we present the opportunity for those tuning in with interest in US-Asia relations to reach out to the US-Asia Institute if they have questions relevant to our future events for this public webinar series. If anyone in the audience would like to follow up with any of our speakers, please reach out to us at usai@usasiainstitute.org, and we will be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the issues we discussed today. For congressional staff in our audience tuning in today interested in other Northeast Asia related matters, USAI will be holding its US-Asia Trade 101 Congressional Briefing Series starting next Monday, September 12th at 3 p.m. in H137. This series seeks to provide unique insights into the US-Asia trade relationship, looking at the history that has brought us to the present moment, the legal frameworks governing trade today, and future possibilities for growth. US-Asia Trade 101's 1-hour sessions offer congressional staff the opportunity to hear from academic, government, and business leaders with direct experience and expertise on US-Asia trade policy. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.